Welcome to a new video in my Node-RED tutorial series, and today I want to talk about subflows, which if you think about like regular programming languages, it's like functions. So where you can package things that you want to use multiple times in a flow. So you don't have to actually replicate things. You can just have a subflow which contains all your logic, and then you can just reuse that logic throughout your flow or multiple flows. And this is not entirely new in Node-RED, but it was definitely not available by the time I started it. So actually I was not using it for a long time, but then I realized that in order to keep the code consistent and clean, it is a good idea to actually use these subflows because it's going to make your life easier. Obviously, as I said, the main reason you want to use them is you can, if you have reusable flows or reusable logic, you can just have it maintained in a single place and then you can just reuse them multiple times. So if you have to make some changes to it, then obviously you change the subflow and all the places where you use this subflow will use the updated logic. And you can use any of the basic flows in a subflow. Obviously, it doesn't have to be one. It can be a fairly complicated logic that you have previously built together and you just want to sort of package it in a smaller subflow. Or you can use function nodes as well. There are a few restrictions within the subflow. So the subflow can either have 0 or 1 inputs. So it doesn't support multiple inputs, but it can have 1 or multiple outputs. So we are going to see that later in the examples. The subflow also supports status nodes. So just like in a function nodes or some of the standard nodes where you have this small text below the node, that's supported for subflows as well. And you can control what is the information that should appear there in, whenever you are using the subflow as an instance in your program. But you're going to see plenty of examples later on for this one. And we are also going to see that these flows are configurable, so you can create internal variables, so you can have its own screen. And some of these functions are also related to the fact that you can actually package them as a separate npm package. But so that is documented in the the Node-RED website, but I'm not going to cover this in that video because I think in most cases you probably want to use these subflows internally. And finally, I do use the context information a lot. So I'm going to talk about how the subflow uses the context. I think I already mentioned the main, structures of this video, what I'm going to talk about, but let's just recap again. So we are going to see how you can create a subflow, either, brand new from scratch or use an existing part of the flow and create that into a subflow. And we are going to also see how you can create, convert single nodes or multiple nodes to a subflow, how you handle the status, so how you can get some text to appear when you are using a subflow, and how we can configure properties. So if you want that subflow to be configurable, you can quite easily do that. And as I said, we also need to use the context in many cases. So we are going to see how the subflow can refer to the parent context. So the context, for example, the flow context of the flow wherever it is running. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to use this simple example. So what is happening here, we have an inject node, and wherever this inject node fires, there is a function node here which generates a random number. And this function node is, it generates a random number which decides whether this number which is getting generated goes up or down. So it's not like, completely random number. So, and also there are some bounds. So here I've configured that this number should be between 100 and 0. And if I create this inject node as an interval or set up it as an interval, then we can see that these numbers get generated. So we see the number here, so it shows up in the node status as well. You can see it here on the inject node as well. And then basically I just have a set of, these smooth nodes. And one is set up to capture the maximum, the other one the mean, and the last one is the minimum of this value. So we are going to see how we can create this as a subflow. And I just realized that I already had the subflow here, but I want to create something new. So I have two different options here. So I can create a subflow from the hamburger menu and Subflow as a create subflow, or I can create a subflow by selecting something in my flow and then move that into a subflow. Let's look at the first example. So if I want to create a new subflow, it looks like this. So it creates a new subflow, and you can see that there is a new section which is appearing here as well. And so if I double click on this one, I can give it a name. So that's going to be my random number generator subflow. And what I want to do now is that I just want to move my function node, because my function node here creates this random number. It's a nice self-sustaining function block, but obviously if I want to generate random numbers in two different places, it's much better if I have a subflow which contains the code once, instead of just copy and pasting the same function node, which obviously opens up the possibility that I make changes to this code here, but I forget to make the same changes on the other instances as well. So this is one good example to use it as a subflow. So what I'm going to do is, well, for the time being, I'm just going to copy the code, and I go to my subflow, and I'm going to create a function node, and I'm just going to paste the code in. And okay, so that basically, I just migrated the functionality over here. So you can see it's exactly the same code as what I had before. Actually, this uses the context to store what was the previous number, so it knows whether to increment that or decrement that, and it also updates the status. So I'm just going to leave everything as it is. And here, up here in the properties, up here in the line, I can specify that, well, this is going to have one input, and this is going to have one output. So they appear as these nodes. They look like the link out and the link in nodes, and you can just wire them together. So obviously whatever input goes to this function node, and the output of the function node goes to the output. And as you can see, the graphics has been updated here as well. So it shows like, it has one input and one output. And by the way, it was already apparent, but when you edit a function node, when you edit a subflow, then it appears in a different tab, just like a flow does. The only difference is that you can close this. So once you don't need that, you can close that, and it's just not going to appear anymore. I mean, once you have moved some of the code into the subflow, you don't really need that, so you don't need to edit that. But if you double click, you can just bring it up again. Okay, so now this random generator function is working. So what I can do now is I can bring this one in, and then basically I can just replace that. So if I do that, I'm just going to replace the wires. Actually, let me delete these wires as well. So if I submit, then we can see it pretty much does the same thing as our function node before. So that's easy. We have just replaced the function node with this guy here with a subflow. And of course, if I need to use it again, I can just drag another instance, and just going to work exactly the same way as the second one. So now I have, the first one. So now I have a second random generator. And as you see, it works, completely different from the previous one. So it's like a brand new instance. It has its own number, and it's generating random numbers, or basically these up and down numbers, completely separate from the previous one. So now we are going to see how we can add the status to the subflow, which is basically this guy here. So you can see that on my original function node, it was actually printing the number that is generating here. So even if you don't use this debug node, it would show the number here. And we can do the same for the subflows as well. So if I go back to my subflow editor, there is a thing here which says status node. So it's going to bring in this new node here, and I can use the status tab, or the status node here to say that it's going to capture the status from all the nodes in this subflow, and it's going to output it, and I'm going to output that into the status. So obviously, I mean, here I only have one single function node, so I mean, yeah, I can just report the status from all the nodes. But if you have a more complicated, Subflow which has multiple function nodes or standard nodes, and you only want one, the status from one of them to appear, then obviously you would select, selected nodes, and then you can select which one you want to basically report its status back to the main Subflow. So I have done that, and now we can see that the status appears in the main flow, under the icon of the Subflow. So this is how you can, do this. It's again very simple. So now we can move on, and we can do something a little bit more complicated, because we can also see how we can move an existing flow or part of the flow into a Subflow. So we have this Subflow which generates these random numbers now, but let's say that I'm going to generate these random numbers in multiple places, but let's say that I always need the maximum, the minimum, and the mean value of these calculated separately, just like I have done here with these 3 nodes. So what I can do here is I can select them, and I can say, Subflow, selection to Subflow. And I get an error because I cannot create a Subflow with multiple inputs. So this is what I said, that's the restriction. But I think I can do a trick here, because I can create a junction here and then maybe just use this junction. Because, essentially it has one input, but then it just splits 3 ways. So if I do this, and if I now try to select the junction as well, which I have done, and if I want to create selection to Subflow, now it's done. So now we have a new Subflow, and I'm going to call this custom stats. And everything is done already. So we have the main, the max, and the min. We have 1 input, and then we have 3 outputs. So this is how I just wanted to show you how you can create 3 different outputs. And as I said, this part doesn't have to be as simple as that. You can even put an entire flow into a Subflow. So there is no limit here. You can use any of the the nodes which are available on your palette. The only thing you cannot use is you cannot use the same flow itself. So you cannot reference to itself, because that's just not allowed. But I should be able to use random flow in this one, the random Subflow here in my custom stats flow. And so Node-RED has done pretty much everything for me. So what I need to do is deploy, and as you can see, it is still working. So yeah, we get this 3 different numbers. They are getting updated based on this random number, and then everything is working. So it's all good. So the next thing we can do is I can show you how you can create environment variables and how you can do some additional customizing. So if I go back to my random flow, and if I do go to edit properties, then, well, we have a name for it. Here I can, specify some additional module properties. So I can give it a name and a description, and especially these fields are relevant if you want to package it as a separate node. So you can have a license, the email, and everything. So I'm not going to maintain that. You can add documentation, which is standard for all nodes. And then finally, you have options here as well to, to show up in, which category. So you want to show up in the separate Subflows category. You want the label to be shown, and you can pick a different number, or you can also pick a different, icon for it. So let me just pick whatever random icon. And also you can name the output as well. So I can do that. So if I deploy, and if I go back to my main flow, now you can see that the icon has changed, and this one says trigger, this one has random number. So actually the name of the input and the output shows up, and it is especially useful if you have multiple. So let's say in the random flow, sorry, not the random flow, the custom stats, I can name the outputs. So max, mean, and min. So now you can see them, just to make sure that you don't wire them incorrectly. But there is one more other thing. We can also, configure, when you double click on this Subflow, You can, rename it. You can give it a different name from random, like I can do random 1. So then now it shows random 1. It's the same naming convention as any other thing, any other node. But then we have the option to specify additional parameters as well. So let's say that I need to able to restrict that bounds, and I need that to be configurable. So what I can do is in the properties, I can create new environment variables, and I can create a... So what I have done, I created a name of the variable. I'm using these sort of like technical names because so just make sure that it doesn't match with any of the other other environment variable which might be used by Node-RED or something else. So I think it's a good idea to use something which is probably unique, so not just min but something else. And then here you can specify a default value. You can specify that the label should be minimum or min, and then it should only accept numbers. And you can also provide an icon, like I can do, double upper. Okay, then there should be max. So max, probably it start with max. So that's max, and then we can create an RND min. It's going to be number 0, and let's use the double down icons, and then min, and it should only accept numbers. Okay, so now we have defined that, and if I deploy and if I go back to my flow, now you can see that I have a max and a min here in the node properties. But we also want to use this. So how we can use this? So in the code we can use, so it is very similar to how we use the flow, the context, which says, context or flow or global, but then we have one which says env, so environment. And and that's RND max. So if the value is not greater than RND max, it should be that. And if the value is smaller than RND min, then it should be RND min. Okay, so now we have this subflow, and this has already gone to, so this is already gone down to almost the minimum, and this one is still a high number. So what happens if I restrict that to 45 and 55? Okay, so this clearly doesn't work here, but I think I know why. So if I go back to the properties, then yeah, I did a typo. So I think probably this is a good idea, just to keep all the environment variables as all caps. So RND max, RND min, because then in the code I also reference this an RND max and RND min in all caps. So if I do this now, and if I go to Subflows, okay, so 55, 45, and if I deploy now it has immediately restricted the value to 52, but this one remains 30 because this has a higher threshold. So again, now you can see that how you can create these properties, these sort of like environment variables, and I accidentally left the buffer option here, which I didn't want to. So this is where in the dropdown you can restrict what type you can select for the environment variable. So I wanted just number only. So you can create many of these, and they show up in the properties screen. You can easily edit them, and obviously these values are per instance of the Subflow when you're using it in your flow. So you see here that this now behaves differently from this one because it has different properties. So this one's 55 to 45, and this one has 100 to 0. And finally, I want to talk about the context. So we have already seen how I can use the context if I'm using, variable. So if I'm using function node, because I can just easily use, context.get, and that's going to be the context for this function node. And we have seen in the example, because we are getting completely different numbers, that actually that context is for each instance separately. But there could be other cases where I want to influence the behavior of my subflow based on some variables on the parent flow. So what I'm going to do here is, here I have created a simple flow, a set of nodes, which you can see that I can create a, basically I can set numbers, and that is getting stored in flow variables max and min. So what happens if I want to use that in my random number generator? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to modify my random number, the flow again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these, because I want the flow, the main flow variable, to control the behavior of my random number generator. So here we are going to do, normally if you want to read a flow variable, you do flow.get max to get to read the value of the max environment flow variable, and then you do min. And I think I just have to go back. Did I specify max min with lowercase? Okay. So random function code, and that's the min. And maybe I should have done some, some additional coding here just to make sure that the max and min exist, but let's just assume that it will exist by the time this flow runs. And for that reason, let me just actually run these, so the flow variables are getting created already. But what I want my function node is to read the flow variable from the parent flow where this subflow is being used, and I can just simply use by typing this, so $parent, and I put it in here. So every single instance. So instead of specifying the name of the flow variable, I prefix it with a $parent dot sign. So if I deploy this, I don't think that we are going to see much. Yeah, but we are going to see that we have some random numbers generated, and then here in this instance we can see that it's not going beyond 80, because the flow variable, the max, is set to 80 as well. But then, this number, or these two numbers, control both of them because they are in the same flow, so they are reading the same flow variable. So what I can do now is I can just select the lower bounds, like 60 and 20. And now we can see that this number has jumped below 60. So now it's, it doesn't go above 60. And well, we can't really test the lower bounds, because all of the numbers are, relatively high now. But I think this already shows how your subflow can access the flow variables of the flow where it is used on. And actually, these are all the tricks and tips I wanted to show you about subflows in Node-RED. And by this we get to the end of this tutorial. So just to recap what we talked about today. So today we understood what is the importance of the subflow, why we want to use it in our flows in order to make our life easier, to make our flow better looking, and of course to avoid duplication of the same logic. So we have seen how we can create a new flow from existing flows, or just create a new flow from scratch. We have seen how we can customize the flow with parameters and icons and appearance and so on. And we also understood how we can use the status node in order to update the status at the just below the flow. And finally, we also looked at how we can access the context of the parent flow in order to exchange data with the rest of the flow logic. So that pretty much concludes this topic. Thank you for watching this tutorial, and hopefully see you in the next video.